Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Good evening. It's internecine, intra-party and increasingly international. But if there's one thing upon which most participants in the referendum campaigns can agree, it is that you can't trust opinion polls. There might be a new one popping up every day, but in the shadow of last year's epic failure to predict anything close to the general election result, they are to be taken with a cellarful of salt. And yet, there is a sense abroad tonight that Leave campaigners today turned their attention back to the economy, arguably their weakest card, because they feel they've more or less sewn up immigration, inarguably their strongest. And while this may not be prompting conniptions on the Remain side just yet, it seems to be causing concern. Newsnight's political editor Nick Watt joins me now to run a rule over all things referendum. Nick, just how much concern?
Well, I think we can say the mood in the Remain camp tonight is a little bit nervous. I was talking to a senior figure who said he thinks it's now time to quote Sir Alex Ferguson, it's squeaky bum time. They're saying that the Vote Leave campaign have had a good run on immigration over the last 10 days, getting their message up that the only way you can control UK borders is to leave the European Union. And then the Remain camp woke up this morning and there was a poll showing that not only were Leave ahead, but Leave have had some success in driving up immigration as a concern amongst voters. I think you're finding that there are real nerves in their camp, and that means there is now a bit of a debate about should the Prime Minister talk about immigration. One minister I spoke to said, why aren't we hearing from the Prime Minister talking about his great deal on Europe, where he imposed a 4-year ban on EU migrants claiming in-work benefits? Another minister said the Prime Minister must talk about immigration, but of course he can't, because it would mean talking about his proposal target to bring net migration down to the tens of thousands, and this minister said that, of course, is unworkable.
So will we see a shift in tone or tactic from the Remain camp to match the shift on the other side?
Well, the message is very clear from the central command of Remain camp. They say that the economy is their trump card and they will stick with that issue. They say that immigration makes people who are already going to vote Brexit more angry, but the issue upon which you can swing voters is the economy. And that is why an increasingly buoyant and confident Vote Leave campaign today were not just talking about the economy, they were delivering what one source described to me as a counterpunch. Let's come in and make the case that staying in the EU is the greater risk on the economy, talking about how the UK might be liable for future Eurozone bailouts, disputed by the Prime Minister, it must be said. But another key message from Vote Leave, they're saying it will not be plain sailing. A number of issues to come ahead. Mansion House speech by the Chancellor and that intervention by Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF.
Indeed, Nick Watt, many thanks indeed. And joining me now is the Energy Minister, Andrea Leadsom, who is part of the Vote Leave campaign. Andrea, I think the day the referendum was announced, the day Boris Johnson gave a mighty fillip to your side by announcing his support for it, and today, the day on which the polls seem to be turning in your favour, they have one thing in common. On all three occasions, the pound fell. Do you know why?
Well, the pound has dipped very slightly today, that is true.
And the other two
But
occasions,
actually,
don't
yes,
forget.
but let's be clear. The pound is a floating currency. It goes up and down every day. And if you look at where the pound is versus the euro, it's roughly about where it was when the Prime Minister came back with his renegotiation. And of course, the trouble is the Remain camp, every time it drops a cent against the euro or against the dollar, claim, oh, that's the result of uncertainty.
To be fair,
it's a floating currency.
That's not the question I asked. I spoke of three specific occasions when there was a measurable drop in the pound. It's not every time the pound drops that the Remain camp are claiming a link. We're looking at the day the referendum was announced, the day the biggest beast on your side announced his support for it, and today, the day that the polls seem to have shifted. There must be a unifying theme as to why the markets would respond so pessimistically to all. Every time the sun shines on the Leave campaign, the pound drops.
Yes. Well, as I say, by a small amount. And there is an old saying in the city, which is buy on the rumour, sell on the fact, which basically means, it's a bit of jargon, jargon that means what happens is a bit of volatility in advance of a big event where traders position themselves to try and make money. Of course they do, that's their job, that's their lifeblood. And so when the event happens, they then hope to take their profits and to carry on with the new reality. And that's what's happening here. And actually that's why it was so disturbing that the Governor of the Bank of England should make an intervention in this debate and start claiming unprovable assertions, because his job is in fact financial stability. So the talking down of the economy by people on the Remain side is actually increasing the volatility. But what you'll find is on June the 23rd, if we vote to leave, those things will settle down.
You mentioned the city, where you used to work, of course, and you mentioned the euro.
Yep.
Interestingly enough, your former employer in the city has focused on the euro and warned that sterling may even reach parity with the euro from its current level of 125 if there is a vote to leave. That is, I'm sure you remember, that's Invesco Perpetual, your former employer.
So, economic forecasting is an honourable profession, but it's only as good as the assumptions that you put into it. And we have seen a raft of economic assumptions, including from the Treasury, that effectively say that if we leave, we won't negotiate any trade other than a basic free trade agreement with the EU. We will pull up the drawbridge, and over 15 years we'll fail to secure a single free trade agreement. And for good measure, as a result of no trade, our productivity will drop.
I'm going to have to steer you back to the question that I actually
No,
asked. This is your former employer.
Yeah.
They go on to warn that in the case of a vote to stay, there would more likely be a rise in the value of sterling. You mentioned Treasury forecasts being unreliable. Were they reliable when you worked at the Treasury?
No, Treasury forecasts are not reliable.
Okay.
Economic forecasting, as I say, is an honourable profession, but it's only as good as the assumptions you put in. But in answer to that point about Invesco Perpetual, the person who I worked with there for many, many years, one of the great investors in the United Kingdom who invest day in, day out in our pensions and our ISAs and so on, his company says that actually there won't be a huge impact from Brexit. People like Roger Bootle, highly regarded in the city, say that there may be some short-term volatility, but actually longer term will be better off. So as I say, economic forecasting is only as good as the assumptions you put into it.
So it's very hard to find people to trust.
Well,
This is the problem.
Well,
The problem that voters face is finding individuals that they find trustworthy.
That is not the issue. That's completely...
I'm a voter, and it is the issue.
But it's not, because you can't predict what you're going to eat for dinner
No, but I
next
can
Friday
identify
night.
who is most trustworthy on issues such
Yes.
as this. You mentioned some. Invesco Perpetual mentioned others. I completely accept that the middle ground. Let's try and find someone who inhabits the middle ground. The journalist Martin Lewis, for example, of the money-saving expert website, identified by The Spectator magazine, I think, as the man most trusted by the British public to provide guidance on this issue, and he provided it today. He described himself as risk-averse, which is why he is in favour of Remain. He laid out many, many reasons why people a little more, perhaps, fond of gambling might want to vote to leave. He is pretty much the gold standard for risk-averse financial forecasting. Can we trust him?
This isn't an issue of trust. This is an issue of the fact that it is not possible to see with a crystal ball into the future. So my point remains the fact that economic forecasting relies on assumptions going into the model. Now, Martin Lewis is saying he's risk averse. His assessment, his personal opinion, is that it's riskier to leave than to remain. My assessment after 25 years in finance is that it's far riskier to remain than it is to leave. In my opinion, leaving means we can negotiate trade with the world, the 80% of the world that is not in the European Union, and that to stay in the EU risks our economy being incredibly damaged by the stagnation of the European economies and by the fact that our budgetary contributions are under control of the EU, not under control of the UK.
You say it's not about trust. Can we trust a man who cites IFS figures in defence of Brexit, who is then roundly told by the IFS that he's used the figures wrongly? Very briefly, if you would. Michael Gove, of course.
This issue is about how possible is it to predict with precision, and the point I'm making is it is not possible to predict with precision. Every prediction relies on your assumptions, and if you assume negative inputs, you will get negative outputs. It's not a matter of trust, it's a matter of those are the facts.
Andrea Leadsom, many thanks indeed. Now, given that they pretty much run the gamut from apocalyptic nightmare to a land of milk and honey, you could be forgiven for thinking that all predictions of what the UK might look like in the event of a vote to leave had been exhaustively explored already. You'd be wrong, though. There is a new option gathering momentum in Whitehall that would see civil servants working furiously to hold on to as much commercial union as possible in the event of a political schism. It's even got a neologism of its own. Flexit. Newsnight's Chris Cook reports.
Whichever way we vote in this referendum, Britain will go on an uncertain journey. The destinations on offer are not too clear, especially as campaigners fighting on each side cannot promise what future ministers will do. Newsnight has learned that civil servants are seriously considering a route for Brexit that is not the same as the official campaign's plan.
The question on the referendum ballot sheet is extremely simple. Should we remain members of the European Union or should we leave it? But on both sides there are enormous uncertainties. For Remain, we don't know how the future political and economic circumstances of the EU will change it. For Leave, the principal set of unknowns are about our future trading relationships with our big partners, particularly the European Union itself.
The official Vote Leave campaign wants us at some distance from the EU. They argue that that would let us trade more with faster growing parts of the world, cut EU red tape and cut net immigration.
If Britain does vote to go it alone and leave the European Union, an important principle to consider is this. The more that Britain uses its new liberties to vary its rules from those applying across the European Union, be they about veterinary care or immigration, the more likely it is that Britain will find itself facing barriers to trading with the EU, be they tariffs or be they simple administrative barriers. Vote Leave's principal argument is that any losses we might suffer on access to the EU's internal market will be more than made up for by trading elsewhere in the world and by the loss of unnecessary EU regulation.
To its fans, the appeal of Vote Leave's plan, which envisages a lot of difference from now, is precisely that it would change things and fast. But others want a gentler Brexit.
It's important to remember that even if Vote Leave win on June the 23rd, Vote Leave won't be running the government and they won't be deciding what our future relationship with the EU will be. That'll be up to the officials, ministers and MPs here in Westminster. Now, I've been speaking to a lot of civil servants who are likely to be involved in any renegotiation of our relationship with Europe if we vote to leave. And one thing's quite striking. Their vision for what Britain's life would be like outside the EU is quite different to the one being put forward by Vote Leave.
A number of very similar plans are being considered in Whitehall on the potential road ahead from a Brexit vote. These route maps by pro-Brexit thinkers are known by names like Flexit, Europe 2.0, or, in Roland Smith's case, Liberal Leave.
How would you go about leaving the EU?
In a multi-step process, basically, we have to initially protect the economics of this thing. That is where the real concerns are. So that means moving to an EEA position, rather like Norway and Iceland.
And that means retaining lots of EU rules and regulations?
At that point, it means retaining a lot of stuff to do with the single market. So yes, we do actually jettison a lot of other things to do with political union, and we jettison some big policies like the Common Agricultural Policy and Common Fisheries Policy.
But you'll keep immigration?
At that moment, we will have to, yes.
Lots of civil servants like a Norway-style European Economic Area membership as the first leg in any Brexit journey to minimise economic disruption. We could then disentangle further at a slower speed on regulation and immigration. Some even think this strategy could prove a model for other EU members.
You would have a Europe which is a small, incredibly integrated space where you have one single currency, where those countries really pool sovereignty, in effect become something like the United States. And you have everyone else in Europe who is part of a free trade space in close partnership with Eurozone Europe, but it's not done in as intensely regulated and sort of controlled a way. It would allow those who want maximum integration to have it. It would allow everyone else to do it at their own pace. What's wrong with that?
But these schemes have a big political weak spot.
Why is it you think Vote Leave haven't gone for your roadmap?
I think perhaps because they have chosen immigration particularly to go big on. Immigration is a very big issue in this country, as we all know, as I accept as well. My issue with it is that the economy is a bigger issue, and that keeps coming up in polls time after time. And therefore, for me, that is actually what we need to focus on in the first instance.
The Remain campaign has plenty of criticism of this model as well.
Well, the Leave campaign have said if we leave the EU, they want us to leave the single market, leave the EU entirely and negotiate a new free trade deal. So if we were to follow the Norwegian EEA model, that wouldn't have a mandate and it wouldn't achieve the things the Leave campaign say they want to achieve. So we wouldn't be able to stop free movement of people. Norway accepts that. We'd still have to accept most EU rules with no say over them at all, and we'd still have to pay into the EU budget. So it's far worse than the deal we have now.
Today, BBC News revealed that lots of pro-Remain MPs want EEA membership if we vote out. They'll have Whitehall allies too. But if Vote Leave win this campaign, ministers may feel they have to cut immigration, especially as the Prime Minister might well soon be from Vote Leave. This is what happens when you pose simple referendum questions on very complex topics.
And still with me is the Energy Minister, Andrea Leadsom. Joining her now is a former head of the World Trade Organization, Pascal Lamy. Mr. Lamy, if we may, obviously the whole European project feels slightly threatened by the prospect of Brexit, but realistically, Chris Cook's report notwithstanding, in the event of a vote to leave, the Union will bend over backwards to keep Britain as close to the centre of business as possible, surely?
Well, that's speculation. The reality, I think, is quite different. The reason why UK joined the European Union 40 years ago was free trade. If UK leaves, it leaves the Union, and it leaves this free trade zone and the single market. It will import more because of the zero tariff which the Brexit campaign says will be the UK trade policy after having left. So less exports because of tariffs in the European Union, which is 50% of UK exports, plus the 50 other countries with whom EU has a preferential trade agreements. So more imports, less exports, less production, less jobs.
But
that's the equation.
This is also speculation, of course.
Well, I've been in trade negotiations for 20 years. Trade negotiations are not about love. They're about hard numbers. They're about clout. They're about bargaining capacity. Standing alone, UK loses the bargaining capacity it has with other countries because it belongs to the European Union and because the European Union is 500 million consumers. Like, by the way, that's the reason why the US, Canada, and Mexico have a free trade agreement. I mean, trade is a world of elephants. 500 million. China, India, more than 1 billion. That's what trade is about. That's what trade negotiations are about. So look at the UK outside in the cold. Again, more imports, less exports. That's roughly what I call shooting in one's foot.
And Andrea Leadsom, we won't be an elephant anymore. I'm not sure what we will be, but it won't be anywhere near as big.
Well, you know, the EU has negotiated free trade arrangements with economies of the size of about $7 trillion US. That's the EU's elephant. Switzerland, with a population of less than 30 million, has negotiated free trade around the world with an economic size of about 27 trillion. So that is, by my reckoning, a great achievement from a far smaller country. And of course, the fleetness of foot is vital. And the EU's own numbers themselves show that because because of their failure to negotiate free trade agreements with some of the world's biggest economies, the UK's jobs have been impacted negatively to the tune of nearly 300,000 jobs. So had we negotiated free trade with big economies, that could have been what the UK achieved. If we leave the EU, we will be able to negotiate those free trade agreements on our own with the world's fifth biggest economy.
I'm sorry to say, but free trade is about negotiations. What will you negotiate? What will you offer to the people you negotiate with? Your policy is zero tariff on the UK market. What will you offer to the others? If they have free access to your market, they're not going to give you anything if they have the free access. It just doesn't make sense. What is a trade negotiation? It's a deal. I give you something, you give me something. Mm-hmm. If you've already given me free access to your market, which is what your campaign is saying, there's not any more reason to have a deal.
No, the campaign isn't saying that the UK will have zero tariffs. The campaign is saying no.
Of course it is. Look, I read very carefully what your colleague Patrick Minford said, and he says zero tariff.
No, Patrick Minford isn't speaking for the Vote Leave campaign. He has his individual views. What these campaigns...
So then, I'm sorry to say,
allow me to tell you.
You are going to close your economy?
No,
you are going to raise...
No, not at all.
Let's hear from...
So what we will do is we will negotiate free trade, and you'll be aware that the average time taken for free trade negotiations is around 28 months on average. As I've said, the likes of Switzerland and Iceland and Singapore have negotiated free trade agreements with all of the world's biggest economies, and the UK will plan to do the same.
They have negotiated free trade agreement because they have a protected economy.
No,
which they have opened. Look, I know Switzerland. Switzerland is a very protected economy. So these countries have a protected economy, and what they do in a negotiation, they lower the protection for the price of market access everywhere, which is, you're absolutely right, which is why Switzerland negotiated a free trade agreement with China. Except that...
And the European Union hasn't.
Except that in that case, the deal is fairly unbalanced because China is a huge market and Switzerland is a small market.
Well, the UK is the world's
if that's
biggest economy.
If that's what you want, which is unbalanced trade deal, I don't think it's a good reason. You may have other reasons, and I'm not entering into that because my area of expertise is trade.
I sense this conversation has barely begun. Unfortunately, for the purposes of this evening at least, it's now got to come to an end. Andrea Leadsom, Pascal Lamy, many thanks indeed.